Okay, welcome back from lunch, everyone, to our post-lunch session and final sessions for our 39th annual conference of Caribbean accountants. I am standing in only temporarily, so don't get worried for our main host, Renata Mohammed, who is seeming to have some post-lunch tech issues. But it is indeed my pleasure to introduce to you Nancy Foran, President and founder of ESG Partners, Inc. Nancy has been a long-standing representative for CPA Canada on the ICAC board, and of course recently transitioned into her own company, providing consulting and advisory services after, of course, as we all know, many changes in terms of CPA and its administration. So I'm pleased to welcome Nancy, and again, thankful for CPA Canada's sponsorship of our event once again, and their ongoing support for several initiatives of the ICAC over the years. I get a glimpse of your furry friend in the background joining your session, but Nancy, thanks again, and you are going to speak to us on ESG matters. So over to you, and I see Renata is also back online now, so take it away.
Great, thank you. And yeah, my apologies for my furry friend making an introduction. She always seems to do that. So I am absolutely delighted to be able to be back with you again. I've been sort of on the other side of these conferences for a number of years in my prior role, but now I'm delighted to be able to head up an organization where we help companies and their investors integrate, manage, and communicate their environmental, social, and governance impact, or ESG impact, while creating enterprise value. As we'll see through this presentation, it's not an either or, it's together. So I guess we can switch over to the slides if that's okay. And as we're doing that, just a little bit of background as well. We work with startup organizations, venture capital, early stage investors, right through the private, public, and not-for-profit organizations in financial services, manufacturing, emerging technologies, in the energy sector, and a few more. So it's definitely a really exciting time, and I'm excited to share with you a little bit about what's going on with ESG. So in terms of an overview, what we'll do is we only have about a half hour, 45 minutes, including Q&A, but we'll talk a bit about ESG and sustainability. Get into a little bit about the disclosure ecosystem, because as accountants, we do like our disclosure frameworks. Talk about the importance of stakeholder engagement and materiality, emerging issues and trends, talk about some integration considerations, and then we'll have time for Q&A at the end. So when we talk about ESG, it's important to start with sustainability. So because it brings us to this point. What's going on in the world around us is really important when we start to think about how we respond and adapt to it. So climate change is permeating almost every aspect of day-to-day life. We're seeing it in the increase in natural disasters, the impact of them, and it really is sort of consuming day-to-day news. We don't really have a day that we don't hear about this. And with that, going hand in hand, is the rate at which we are losing biodiversity. And the impacts of biodiversity loss and the rate of it is very significant in and of itself, but over half of the world's GDP is actually tied directly to biodiversity. And so that has significant ramifications even beyond just those social ones. The amount of waste that we as a planet continue to generate, as we are highly disposable, and I know there's a lot of regulation trying to curb that, but that's definitely had impacts. Human rights violations that are happening around the world, that those, in addition to the increase in poverty and inequality that was highlighted during the COVID pandemic, has forced us to take a whole look at those social issues in a much more focused way and a purposeful way over these last couple of years, especially. And then while economic growth is looked at as being, a really important piece, a great way to measure our success, at the same time, if not handled appropriately and if not planned for appropriately, it will exacerbate these other issues that I just talked about. So they really do all go hand in hand. The World Economic Forum, it's important to look at this. They are a not-for-profit foundation based in Geneva. They're an independent international organization that aims to help shape global, regional, and industry agendas. And each year they issue a top 10 global risks report. In 2022, the report reflected that 8 of the 10 top risks in terms of severity are all ESG factors, and the top 3 being climate or environmental factors. And it's no surprise what comes in 9th and 10th place is the debt crisis, given all of the investment that has happened because of the COVID pandemic, and then the geoeconomic situation that we continue to find ourselves in as we continue to globalize as well. So these issues are leading us to rethink how we view capitalism, where companies do not focus primarily or solely on optimizing short-term profits for shareholders, but seeking to create and generate long-term value by taking into account the needs of all stakeholders and society at large. And this is that concept of stakeholder capitalism. It really does place people and planet at the center, with companies being part of the overall ecosystem and not just at the center of it. It gives rise to this idea of sustainable business, where again, stakeholder capitalism is front and center. And it's in response to the increasing pressures that businesses are seeing from all stakeholders. So from not only just investors, but from employees, from customers, suppliers, governments, associations, not-for-profits, those sorts of organizations. And in addition to that, investors and stakeholders are demanding action from the companies or the organization that they choose to support or spend time or money with. And it's leading to innovation, efficiencies, improvement in operations, and a more holistic view towards sort of the environment that a business is working in. And also, it's leading to the need for organizations, I say companies here, but it's organizations across the board, to begin to own and tell their own story. And it used to be that when we talked about telling a story, it was a made-up one or a fictitious one, but this couldn't be less the truth in this case. It really is about owning that information about the company and being able to disclose it in a way that is very robust. And so we'll talk about that, because that leads us to ESG. So ESG simply refers to the environmental, social, and governance factors that can impact the long-term sustainability and societal impact of a company. It represents a variety of risks and opportunities for companies that would include things like, on the environmental side, some environmental factors it looks at would be pollution, energy and water use, resource extraction, waste management, and climate change. Social factors include things like inclusivity or inclusion, diversity, equity, employee treatment and their satisfaction and compensation, working conditions, and human rights. And human rights and working conditions, that's very much getting a lot of attention on a global scale right now, especially when we start looking at incidents of forced labor and continued child labor. Health and safety, data protection, cybersecurity, those sorts of things all fall within that social pillar when we start looking at the risks facing an organization. And the governance factors are things like shareholder and stakeholder engagement, internal codes of conduct and policies, executive compensation, board diversity, political contributions and lobbying, audit practices, and transparency. So essentially, ESG is a holistic evaluation that looks beyond financial performance alone by assessing the environmental and social impacts that may impact an organization's operations and its ability to meet its strategic priorities. And if an organization isn't operating effectively and not able to meet its strategic priorities, it will have financial impacts. So that's how the two really do come hand in hand. And the metrics that are used to assess environmental, social, and governance issues really do need to hone in and describe those specific aspects of a company's sustainability performance that are of interest to the company or the organization's audiences or stakeholders, such as those potential investors, governments, employees, and the general public. So over the last number of years, we've had a lot of sort of nuance language that has come to light. So, you know, working in this space for a little while now, I'm often hearing, oh, we've already got a really good corporate social responsibility, policy. We already embrace sustainability. So I think it's really important to clarify what is CSR or corporate social responsibility, what's sustainability, and what's ESG. So CSR, corporate social responsibility, tends to focus on those initiatives that an organization will undertake that allows it to connect more deeply or to support its employees or the communities where it operates or has an impact, if you will. And quite often there's no true verifiable way or objective way of being able to say whether or not it's actually having an impact. And quite often the CSR activities or initiatives don't necessarily support the core strategy of the organization. It really is an opportunity to give back and to embrace those social issues. So if anything, that CSR would fall under that social pillar. So again, showing it's not the full ESG perspective. Sustainability is actually defined through the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which I'm sure many of you are very familiar with. And it really does look at ethical and responsible business practices, environmental issues and commitments. You know, again, employee diversity, equity, inclusion, those sorts of factors. And in some ways, sustainability actually provides that framework or a framework for ESG. But when we get into the conversation around ESG, it's really about providing that set of criteria around these initiatives, around organizational performance that can be measured and disclosed, measured, benchmarked, compared, and in many cases, third-party verified. So it really does look into sort of peeling back that onion a bit to create that transparency. And quite often we sort of look at why is ESG reporting important? And it's no different than financial reporting. And I have these ordered in a certain way, but you could order them in any way that works. It's really about creating trust and credibility and showing that you're accountable as an organization to your stakeholders. And you're doing so creating trust. I'll digress for a second. I just had a meeting with a client a couple of days ago, and that was a big topic of our conversation, was around trust. How do you build trust? How do you reinforce that trust? How do you gain trust that you may have lost or looking to get? And it really does come down to this whole idea about transparency and making sure that you hone in on what's important to your stakeholders. So ESG reporting is important for investors, but not just for investors. It really is the case that all stakeholders want to know whether an organization is prioritizing the social and environmental issues that they hold dear to them, and they want to have clarity on how those issues are being addressed and managed. So although it has been a topic that was previously reserved for for publicly traded companies for their investors, there's no question that ESG is permeating all organizations at all levels. Working whether it be not-for-profit organizations, small, medium-sized enterprises, all those organizations are facing pressures from within their supply chains or value chains, from government, from governmental organizations, from employees and how they engage with their employees. So it really is permeating all areas of business and industries. So in response to that, the global community has responded with a wide range of sustainability reporting and disclosure frameworks and tools. Depending on who you listen to and what information you read, there's anywhere from 400 to 600 of these tools that are available in this whole disclosure ecosystem, as I call it. So if I put into 3 buckets, and I borrowed this visual because I thought it was so effective from the GRI, which is one of those standards that you can see in that blue circle. So standards, as we're familiar with as accountants, they are specific, comparable, and detailed requirements for what should be reported for each ESG topic. So examples of these standard-setting bodies would be the Global Reporting Initiative, or the GRI, and the SASB standards, and SASB standing for Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. And we'll talk a bit more about the SASB standards in a minute. And there's this, well, I'll park it there, but we'll talk about the role of SASB standards in the international conversation in just a minute. And then frameworks. So frameworks are a set of principles. So that principles-based guidance on how information should be structured and prepared and what broad topics should be covered. So one of the frameworks that we hear about a lot right now is the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or the TCFD, and also the UN Sustainable Development Goals offers a great framework as well. When we get into the ESG rating and analytic providers, or those ranking and raters, what they are organizations that use unique methodologies to score and rank individual companies based on their comparison on ESG assessments or elements. So what their aim is to be able to help mostly investors assess a company's risk in the environmental, social, and governance realm. So in turn, an investor can help assess its associated risk exposure. And it looks also, these rating agencies look at how well a company, like inherently, what risks are in a certain industry, what risks are facing a company, how do they address and manage those. And then these ranking and rating agencies aim to give them a score, compare them against their peers. There's a lot of conversation going on around this area right now because they are not regulated, and because of the high degree of importance that the investment community and others place on the outputs from these rating agencies. There's not a lot of transparency. It's really creating quite a conversation. So I think we'll see a lot of movement around how we look at the information that's coming out of these rating agencies, and then how much transparency has to start coming forward. So one thing I'll say, if you hear about the alphabet soup in this whole conversation, now you can see why. There's a lot of letters up there. So this is definitely part of it. So if I talk a little bit about, and I won't go into all of them, that's for sure, but just because these ones are quite important. So the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board is very investor focused, and it meets the needs of the capital markets with information about the sustainability issues that are deemed most important to enterprise value creation. So the SASB standards are based on an industry-specific approach. So there are 77 industries that have been defined within these SASB standards. And within each of those industries, there's certain metrics and targets, or not targets, but metrics and the accounting performance around those metrics that are deemed important for the particular industry. One company often doesn't find itself falling under one industry or another. Sometimes it can, cross two or three of them. But the standards really allow for a company to know, without having to do a lot of work, to say, okay, this is what's important to my most important stakeholder, which is an investor. But again, very investor focused. The GRI, or the Global Reporting Initiative, takes a broader stakeholder view, really looking at defining those stakeholders as those being significantly impacted or affected by the organization's activities, products, and services, or those whose actions can affect the organization in its ability to meet its objectives. So those groups being civil society, consumers, employees, investors, and policymakers. So the GRI standards are topic specific, which helps companies report on those impacts, and they look at economy, environment, and society, and also some impacts on human rights. So broader stakeholder view versus investor focused. Then I talked about the TCFD quickly, but the most significant driver, I would say, in the demand around ESG reporting is the climate crisis. That is really the driver for a lot of this. Of course, the social issues too, but the climate crisis is it's so urgent, it's so there, and it's impacting, assets and all those sorts of things. So it's becoming a critical and central issue for governments around the world, and it's driving national commitments around emissions and achieving net zero. So there's this growing attitude as well that voluntary disclosures are no longer sufficient, and we need to move towards mandating disclosures around this area. So back in 2015, the Financial Stability Board created a task force, the TCFD, to create a set of recommendations that would help understand sort of that inherent risk that is present in our financial system as it relates to climate, and also look and help a company be able to have a framework to also assess some opportunities that may result from this as well. So in 2017, this framework was released. There are 11 recommendations within the TCFD, and they fall under 4 pillars, or in this case, 4 circles, all interlocking. But so how, from a governance perspective, how are climate-related issues, risks, and opportunities being overseen? How are they being managed from a strategy perspective? How are they being integrated into that financial and strategic planning? How is it fitting into your overall enterprise risk framework? And what are the metrics and targets that you have in place to help prioritize, measure, and assess and be accountable? I know that in a couple of sessions from this one, you'll be hearing from, I believe it's EY, talking about climate risk and accountability. So I won't say too much more about that, but it's just important to understand how that fits into the overall ecosystem. And this just gives you a sense of where in the world there is being regulation introduced around mandatory climate disclosures. A really interesting conversation you may be aware of that's happening right now in the United States is they've gone quite far in saying what they want it to be disclosed in terms of climate, like the climate impacts, emissions, all those sorts of things. And there's some pushback going on right now as they do a great stakeholder engagement. So it'll be interesting to see how the US responds to this. And then in Canada, just in our federal budget that was issued earlier this year, and they introduced mandatory climate disclosures for banks and insurance companies beginning in 2024. And so when you think about that and where the financial institutions are now responsible for this, how that will trickle through the entire pipeline. So again, private companies and public companies. And then, of course, the UN Sustainable Development Goals. I think these tend to be more understood by everybody a little bit more readily, so I won't spend too much time on it, other than to say they are a call to action, and governments know they can't do it alone. They need support from every sector, industry, and organization around the world to be able to, allow us to have social progress, economic development, and climate and environmental responsibility. So if you were left from those last couple of slides with your head spinning a little bit, join the club. There's a lot of us definitely feeling that way. And imagine if you're a preparer of this information, having to meet the needs of all these different bodies in order to be able to be open and transparent about your performance around environmental, social, and governance issues. So in response, the global market has been asking for more standardization, more collaboration. So the 5 bodies that are listed at the top, they announced, a year and a half, almost 2 years ago, their intent to collaborate more effectively. And they have been working to collaborate. And so taking it a step further, though, in June of last year, the International Integrated Reporting Council and the SASB Board, so the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, formalized their intent to collaborate through a merger. And through that merger, last June, they created the Value Reporting Foundation. So they've taken 2, brought it down to 1 foundation to encompass both areas, if you will, of sustainability standard setting and oversight and disclosures. Then in November of last year, during the UN Climate Conference in Glasgow, so COP26, Confederation of the Parties, it was announced that the IFRS Foundation, which is the same organization that oversees international financial reporting standards, so that they announced that the IFRS Foundation would launch a International Sustainability Standards Board. So what's happened is, by virtue of that announcement, we have a foundation, the IFRS Foundation, that now has international financial standards and international sustainability standards. And so they would come under one umbrella. In addition to that, this other sort of middle bubble, if you will, the Climate Disclosure Standards Board, would be wound up into that, as would the Value Reporting Foundation. So that's going from 3 down to 2, I guess, and then into 1. So really trying to streamline that. So the Climate Disclosure Standards Board it already has been wound up. It wound up in January. And the Value Reporting Foundation, that merger of the Value Reporting Foundation into the IFRS Foundation, will be effective July 1st of this year. Keeping in mind what I said before about investor focused versus broader stakeholder focused, knowing that the IFRS, the International Sustainability Standards under the IFRS would be very much investor focused initially, an MOU was signed between the GRI and the IFRS Foundation back in March to make sure that we could have a 2-pillar reporting structure, one for sustainability standards related to investor focused information, and one related to a multi-stakeholder audience. So the GRI and the IFRS Foundation coming together to have 2 pillars focused on broader stakeholders, investors, both of equal importance, but both sharing that broader sustainability information that's so important. So just quickly to summarize this, the ISSB, or the International Sustainability Standards Board, will be under the IFRS Foundation, and all those standards out for public consultation. They will build on the widely used SASB, or Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, and also building on the TCFD, so those climate-related financial disclosures. And I've already have been looking quite closely at these standards that are out for consultation, and you can definitely see both very much coming into it, especially that TCFD standpoint and those 4 pillars that we talked about. So needless to say, the challenges in ESG integration and reporting, multitude of frameworks and standards being addressed, the lack of harmonization in standards, again, being addressed. Then we get into materiality and changing regulation and trends. And so we're going to get into that now. So when we talk about stakeholders and materiality, that interconnectedness between the two is so important. It really is understanding what's most important to those who are most important to you as an organization. And the companies, and I sort of pulled this from a project I just worked on recently with our government and our renewable energy sector. And it really is trying to create that that awareness and that understanding of those areas that are most fundamental to your organization, because you can't do everything at once. It's like basic resource allocation. You can't do everything at once, and you have to start setting priorities. It's no different in the ESG world. So when we look at stakeholders, bit of a laundry list, I apologize for this, but identifying the stakeholders is such an important step. And organizations quite often take this for granted. So defining those entities or individuals that can reasonably be expected to either significantly impact your organization's activities, products, and services, or those who you will have an impact on as an organization. So it really is that two-way street. And understanding what's most important to them is a key consideration, and it will help you be able to listen to what's coming around the corner, what don't you know, and that strong stakeholder engagement will allow you to build deeper relationships. And to be honest, well, somewhat, of a tangent here, but we're seeing that a lot in the supply chain disruptions that are happening now. The companies who have really strong engagement with their stakeholders, they're able to weather the storm and be more resilient when it comes to what we're seeing in the supply chain challenges, because they will get preferential treatment, or their customers will be more forgiving, or the price volatility won't be quite as great. So it really is important on a number of fronts. So then once the stakeholder analysis is done and you know what's important to your stakeholders, and I will say that not all stakeholders are equal. I'll go back to this for a second so you can get a sense. Not all stakeholders are equal, and not all stakeholders will be the same across all organizations. They won't be the same across industries or within industries. You really have to look at what's most important to your own organization and really do that due diligence. So to say that. So once you know who your stakeholders are, what's most important to them, and how they can affect you, then you can start to talk about materiality. This is really how you prioritize and focus and set those metrics and targets so you can be accountable to them. So in the case of when we go back to sort of looking at the standards, this is where the standards can really help. So SASB has already come out and said, this is what your investors want you to be focused on. So, at a minimum, you need to focus on those certain issues depending on what industry you're in. The GRI, same thing. The UN Sustainable Development Goals, those 17 goals, they do have a lot of great insight now into how organizations and companies can start to apply those in a very direct way. Also, another way to look at those issues you most closely need to manage as it relates to environmental, social, and governance factors is look at your peers, look at the competitive environment, look at what others are doing in your space, and then keep an eye on the industry trends and what's going on. And so another way to look at this materiality conversation is look at it from that financial materiality and impact. What's going to affect your enterprise value? What's going to affect the stakeholders? If you can look at those two together, then you get what's called a concept of double materiality. So you'll make sure you cover it all. Goes back to those two pillars that I was just talking about with the GRI and the International Sustainability Standards Board. This is the same thing. And if you can look at it from that fuller perspective, you'll make sure that you address the needs most often of your stakeholders. And one final word on this before we move off the topic of this, because this is just so important. What I have clients come to me most often and say is, I just don't know how to prioritize. We have so many issues. Everyone feels that they're important. They're all of the highest importance. And we hear this all the time too, just in business, right? And so by looking at a materiality matrix, which quite closely resembles an enterprise risk heat map, right? You look at what is going to be your impact on your stakeholders, what's your impact on the organization, and then plot it out. And just do some work to be able to get the priorities and the relative impacts as well. And you make sure that whatever's in that top right-hand quadrant, that you're focusing on those issues. And what I will say about this as well is just because an issue may not be top of mind to your stakeholders on any given day, don't let it drop off your radar. For example, if you were to do a stakeholder engagement and ask a question around employee health and safety, and let's say employee health and safety, you have a flawless record, it may not come top of mind for some of your stakeholders, but it's so fundamental to your organization that you don't want to lose that. So, just to know that just because it may not be top of mind because you're doing it well, not to lose sight of it, because once it falls off your radar, it may not get the focus it needs. Not an easy balance, I know, but I just throw that out there. So I put this in just to try to give it some context before we wrap this piece up. And we're looking at it from so give me some examples. What are some risks that we're really talking about? So when you start to think about it from an environmental perspective, think about climate change and the potential to damage your infrastructure and how you have to plan for that, rising sea levels. And, what sort of investments do you need to make today that may not have that traditional payback period that we're used to seeing as accountants? Or it may not have, you won't be able to do the same calculations. You have to think of things differently. Severe drought is impacting supply chains. It's impacting accessibility to food. It's also impacting how our employees can work, given where we may be and where we have operations. And then again, supply chain collapse. We saw that during COVID, and that's going to continue to be an issue as we keep running into a lot of these issues. From a social perspective, human rights violations. A perfect example, when we started to talk about the move to solar, the silicone that's sourced for solar panels, depending on what jurisdiction they come from, they may use forced labor. That's a big issue, and that's what a lot of governments now are putting some regulation around, that you have to know about that and disclose it. So quite an issue for businesses. And then labor standard infringement, exposure to litigation. Think about the reputational risks that go along with that, right? And then governance, being sure that there's no bribery and corruption. How do you secure against that? Board diversity, make sure that your board represents the stakeholders that you're representing as an organization. And of course, tax law compliance, another example. So finishing up with ESG implementation. If you're thinking about this, you've been thinking about this for a while, or you're just new to this, what are some things to think about? Just want to give you some things to take in mind and go forward with. I love this study from PwC from last year. And what they did was they wanted to know, like, they surveyed about 1,200, a little over 1,200 CEOs around the world, and said, what's keeping you from adopting an ESG strategy? And at that time, there was this sense that you had to either choose an ESG strategy and balancing those priorities with growth targets. Increasingly, we're seeing they are one and the same. And by embracing an ESG strategy, you will have more stable growth and embrace new opportunities. And of course, no surprise, lack of standardization in reporting and the standards. So how to get started? Look at where you are now. In so many cases, and I would say like 99% of the cases, there's not an organization that's not already doing some of this. Whether it be you have a good environmental health and safety policy, you have a focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, or you have cybersecurity policies. That's all ESG. You just have to think about whether or not those are the most important ones to your stakeholders and start to think about how to truly measure it, articulate it, and get some structure around it. Then look at where you want to be in the future. That's where the stakeholder engagement and materiality assessment come into play. Set clear ESG goals and targets and figure out how you're going to get there. You need to have a strategy to get there. The companies right now that are being accused of greenwashing are the ones who have, or there's a lot of conversation around that. We can't go down there, but okay, we're going to be net zero by 2050. And then that's it. So they make that claim, but there's no path whatsoever to get there. Have to be really careful that if you're going to make a claim about where you're going to be in the future in ESG, that you have a plan to get there. And then how do you measure your progress? So gather that data. A lot of work, EY actually did a great survey as well, and we're able to assess that I think it was only 56% of companies who have already implemented robust ESG policies and frameworks and strategies in their organization. Over 56%, I think, were still using Excel spreadsheets to track the information. And while that can be problematic moving down the road, I would say, great, as long as you can start somewhere, start tracking the information, Excel is a great tool to use. And then you'll start to figure out what do you need to support your overall information gathering process, and then you can pick the right sort of more integrated solution. But start somewhere. Excel is a great place to start. So we've already talked about this, but some of the benefits of integration, it will lower your cost of business because you're going to be more focused on productivity, more focused on efficiencies, and reducing your waste, improve stakeholder engagement, stronger brand image, and less of a chance of reputational damage if you don't embrace some of these things. And increasingly, I assume it's the same in the Caribbean. I'm sorry, I don't know this, but I know throughout Canada and the US we're hearing this, is there is such a challenge to get access to talent, and we can't find enough employees to do the jobs that we need to have done. And organizations who are embracing ESG strategies are attracting employees because employees see themselves as being important to the company under the S pillar, and also they can relate and align with the purpose. And it's all about creating your purpose and defining your purpose, and employees will be drawn to that. So finally, finish up with some trends that we're seeing. Climate change is becoming more urgent, and the physical impacts of it can't be ignored. Regulation is going to continue to intensify as we move from voluntary to mandatory disclosures. We're going to have to disclose our emissions, and carbon pricing is going to drive a lot of this too. Social equity, we have seen this greatly over the last couple of years. I mean, the death of George Floyd and all of the conversation that started around that, Me Too movement, so many issues have definitely percolated to the top, so we can now see them and focus on them and know how to address them and call them out. ESG in procurement decision-making and supply chains will continue to intensify. So where organizations who are small, medium-sized organizations or not-for-profits have felt, we don't have to worry about this. We aren't looking for big investor dollars. Yes, you will, because those who you sell to or supply to are going to start demanding it. So it really is percolating down throughout the whole system. We talked about greenwashing quickly, but the whole idea about greenwashing is just overstating what you're doing in terms of trying to really embrace these things. And to address that, we're going to also see the need for some external verification on some of this information. So third-party audits, so like what we do with financial reporting. And sustainability and financial reporting is going to become more integrated, as we're seeing through that sort of IFRS foundation that I talked about, and that will continue to come together, which is a good thing. And then finally, data. We talked about data a little bit and how to track it and get integrity around it and standardization, and again, that third-party verification. And I mentioned here as well about the greenhouse gas emissions and carbon offsets. And there's this whole idea about scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions and tracking all of that. And it's important to know which falls into which category and how you can actually go about tracking it. And I will share these slides so you can have all this later, because I know I'm finishing up quickly because I realize we're at the end of our time here. Concluding thoughts, the pace of change is definitely increasing. Geopolitical unrest is likely to continue. What we're seeing in Eastern Europe right now is just tragic. And it's just creating such instability that I think organizations now need to be prepared that there may be more of these issues, which are tragic. ESG issues are dynamic, and what I mean by that is what was important yesterday may not be important tomorrow. And COVID has definitely taught us that. I mean, I think every organization probably had a global pandemic on their risk register. Not many actually knew how to address it when it actually happened, and those that did were the ones that were able to just hit the ground running and never missed a beat. Small, medium-sized enterprises are not immune, as I mentioned. Mandatory ESG disclosures are on the horizon, and indeed, companies can do well by doing good. So with that, I think we have a few minutes, even though we started a bit late. I still think we have a few minutes for questions. So Renata?
Nancy, thank you so very much. I felt like we just got ESG 101 in the 40 minutes allotted to you. It was a lot to take in, but you broke it down nicely. Feel free to share your slides with us at the end of the day. If ESG is currently not a consideration right now for companies, it's just, not up there in terms of priorities, is it the role of the accountant to bring it to the table? Whose responsibility does that fall under? And, how do you start that conversation, to just say, look, this is now something that's of importance?
That is such a great question, because I would say everyone. So quite often there'll be an organization and there'll be a champion in the organization who says, this is important, we have to escalate this. No matter what, in order to have traction, you need to have the tone from the top. So that's why whenever I'm sort of going through, step by step, where do we need to get to, make sure your board or your senior executive team or your CEO, that you have that tone from the top, that it can percolate down. Because to do this well, you do need to have some allocation of resources, whether that be people or money or investment or what have you. It doesn't have to be a ton right off. It's just a matter of starting the conversation. The role of the accountant, absolutely. I mean, because the accountant in an organization or the external accountant who advises the organization, they are in the best spot. They're the trusted advisor. They can bring together all of this information. They look at the risks that might be facing the organization. And if you have that ability to be able to advise on that and to be able to let them know, this stuff is important. It's coming down the pipe. And the organizations and the companies that can get ahead of this now while it's voluntary will be in such good stead, because, it's sort of, it's a shame that we tend to wait till a crisis happens to bring on change. But if we don't start looking at, even if we don't, like as a company, and you don't have a large environmental footprint, but if you don't show that you care about this stuff, employees still aren't going to come work there. You're not going to have customers want to buy from you because you seem as if you don't care. You need to own your story. You need to set your own destiny. So yeah, the accountant has a tremendous role as that trusted advisor and that voice of expertise. But again, it's got to come from the top in order to have it really take hold. Hope that answers the question.
It does. Thank you. And we have a bit of a heavy question, but this one is coming from our president, so I got to ask it.
Okay. Thanks, David.
I assume that fallout or risk from the pandemic would come under environmental risk. However, the pandemic led to social and governance risk for some. How have practitioners applied ESG strategy in the face of the pandemic, and has the approach changed any?
Well, I guess I don't know that. Let me take this in pieces and hope that I get to the issue. So the pandemic and pandemics in general will be exacerbated because of climate change. As our planet warms, we're going to see more of these issues. And the pandemic had the impact, believe it or not, of actually helping the climate because we actually reduced our emissions for at least, a solid 6 months to a year because planes were halted, travel stopped. We found a new way of doing business, such as this. I mean, we would have all been on a plane coming to this conference as opposed to doing it in this way. So there were some environmental impacts. But you're quite right. The pandemic highlighted the inequities or inequalities that we had in our whole social structure. Certain groups, certain minorities, certain genders were disadvantaged disproportionately from the pandemic, and that had real rippling effects, and it really did. And it did really bring a lot of issues to light. But from a practitioner perspective, I don't know if I can speak about that directly because I guess it depends on what role or what focus that practitioner had. So I'm not sure exactly. I quite understand that piece of it. I mean, it's definitely changed the way they've done business. It's definitely going to change the way they assess risk and how they advise the company because now we have more information around how that was all, how everything was handled by the organization and set up different infrastructures and make investments in different ways. But yeah, I'm just not sure I understand exactly that piece of the question.
Not a problem. And I'm sure you and David could have long conversations about this, but he did send a note. Well answered. Thank you very much.
Oh, boy, thank you.
Mission complete. I am seeing more and more, final question, ads for the roles of sustainability officers or sustainability managers. Is that a new title that we're going to have to cater to within our org charts? Of course, there are persons like you that we can reach out to for guidance and consultancy, but as we plan ahead and create our next strategic plan and org charts, is that someone we should consider?
Yeah, there's a couple of ways to look at this. Now, by calling it out and by having, a chief sustainability officer or an ESG department, by calling it out, you're definitely putting you're putting attention, you're saying this is important to us and we are going to bring this together. The true sort of golden nugget, if you will, is when you have these issues permeating through the entire organization. I'll draw an analogy. Like if you have your enterprise risk management, like your risk management framework. So you've got your risk framework, here it is. And alongside of that, you have an ESG risk framework. And so having them side by side, you're bringing out attention and calling out the differences. But when you can integrate them together, that's where the real value is. So I guess to answer your question quickly, yeah, I think we're going to see more sustainability departments pop up, more directors of sustainability roles, more ESG departments, those sorts of things, absolutely. Over time, and as we do start to let everything settle and it really is truly integrated, we might start to see these responsibilities truly integrate throughout the organization. But in the short term, yeah, I think we have to in order to have it called out there. One thing I do want to say, though, because I think this is the important piece, is going back to that earlier question about the tone at the top. From a governance perspective and at your board level, you need to make sure that there is, if it is a company with a board, and if not, then, an ESG committee internally or something, you do have to have accountability for those particular metrics and oversight clearly defined. So at a board level, sometimes within the enterprise risk or if you have like an enterprise risk I'm using the wrong term, like risk and audit committees. That's what I was trying to say. That might be a great place for oversight of this to sit, or responsibility for it, of course, overall oversight with the board. If you have an ESG committee, make sure you've got enough senior level people on the committee so accountability can be there, but you still have a cross-departmental scope. So a number of different ways to do it, but in short, yeah, I think we're going to see these roles pop up. I don't think you have to necessarily plan for them. Just make sure you've got the function covered somewhere.
Nancy, we'd like to thank you so very much for your time and your sharing today. And of course, you continue to remain a friend and active member, affiliate member of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of the Caribbean. We miss seeing you in the Caribbean region, but we appreciate that you are a phone call away and always willing to assist and share with us.
Absolutely.
So thank you so very much.
Great. Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.